What happens when a petty thief targets the wrong black boy, believing that he is an easy victim? Watch as a determined boy and his loyal dog refuse to back down in the face of danger and take matters into their own hands. From a tense confrontation in the neighborhood to a gripping manhunt where justice is delivered, watch as courage and resilience triumph over intimidation. The neighborhood was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Jamal walked steadily, one hand gripping the leash of his German shepherd, Rocky. The familiar weight of his backpack rested comfortably on his shoulders. He wasn't in a hurry. This was his favorite part of the day, walking Rocky and letting the noise of the world fade into the background. Rocky's nails clicked against the pavement, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. "You smell something, boy?" Jamal asked with a grin, tugging the leash lightly. Rocky's ears perked up, but after a moment, he relaxed and kept moving. Jamal adjusted the strap of his backpack. It carried his most important things: a few school books, his notebooks, and his school laptop, something his dad had reminded him to keep safe. "That thing costs too much for you to lose it," his dad always said. Jamal rolled his eyes every time, but deep down, he knew his father was right. He passed a parked car along the side of the street and didn't notice the figure standing just beyond it, watching him. Mike leaned against the fence of an empty house, half hidden in the shade. His grimy jacket hung open, his eyes sharp as they tracked the boy's movements. His gaze lingered on the backpack, heavy, sturdy, the kind that carried something worth taking. "Nice bag, kid," Mike muttered under his breath, a crooked grin creeping onto his face. Jamal walked on, completely unaware. The street was empty. No cars passing, no people sitting on porches or chatting in driveways. Just the sound of the breeze rustling leaves and Rocky's rhythmic footsteps. It wasn't until they passed a second parked car that Rocky suddenly tensed. His ears shot up, and he let out a low, rumbling growl. "What now?" Jamal murmured, stopping to glance down at his dog. "You're acting weird today." Rocky's sharp eyes fixed on something behind them. Jamal turned quickly, his heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing. Just the quiet street, the houses bathed in golden sunlight. He frowned. "Ain't nobody there," he muttered, pulling the leash to keep Rocky moving. Still, he couldn't shake the prickling feeling at the back of his neck. Mike had already slipped further down the sidewalk, cutting across the grass to stay out of sight. He smirked to himself as he moved, crouching slightly to stay hidden behind the trees lining the block. He wasn't in a hurry. No one was out here. Jamal turned onto a narrower side street. This road was quieter, shaded by tall oaks that arched overhead. Rocky had relaxed a little, his tail wagging gently, but Jamal kept glancing back over his shoulder. The silence felt heavier now, thicker somehow. He told himself he was just being paranoid. Then he heard it, footsteps, soft, deliberate. Jamal froze mid-step. He didn't turn right away, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. "Rocky, you hear that?" he whispered. Rocky let out another growl, sharper this time. Jamal turned slowly, his breath catching in his chest. Mike was there. The man stepped out from behind a tree, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He wore a crooked grin on his face, and his eyes flickered from Jamal to the backpack on his shoulders. "Afternoon, kid," Mike said casually, his voice rough and low, like gravel dragged across pavement. Jamal stared at him, his fingers tightening on Rocky's leash. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to sound calm. Mike raised his hands like he meant no harm. "Relax. I'm just walking. Same as you." His tone was too smooth, too easy, and Jamal didn't buy it for a second. Rocky growled louder, his body tense as he positioned himself between Jamal and the man. "Nice dog," Mike said, the grin twitching wider. "Looks like he's got a lot of energy." Jamal took a small step back, his stomach twisting uncomfortably. "We don't want any trouble," he said. Mike laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Trouble? Nah, I was just admiring that bag you're carrying. Looks nice. Must have something real important in there." Jamal's heart thudded. "It's mine." Mike's smile flattened. He tilted his head, taking a slow step forward. "Everything's gotta belong to somebody, right? Rocky barked, loud and sudden, the sound like a warning shot that echoed through the empty street. Mike's eyes darted to the dog, and for a moment, Jamal thought he might back off. But then, Mike took another step closer, his grin curling into something sharper. "You ought to keep that dog quiet," he said, his voice lower now, colder. "Wouldn't want him getting hurt." Jamal swallowed hard, his palms sweating as he tugged the leash tighter. Rocky didn't budge, his teeth bared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Just leave us alone," Jamal said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. Mike ignored him, his eyes locked on the backpack again, lingering there like a vulture spotting a meal. "Come on, kid. Why don't you make this easy? Hand over the bag, and I'll be on my way." Jamal's stomach twisted. His fingers gripped the strap of his backpack instinctively as he stepped back again. "No," Mike's grin vanished. His face hardened, and he stopped playing friendly. "Don't make this hard on yourself." Rocky's growl turned into a snarl, louder and more dangerous. The leash strained in Jamal's hands as the dog's body coiled tight like a spring. For the first time, Jamal saw it, Mike's frustration turning into anger. The man's voice dropped into a low snarl. "I said give me the bag." Jamal didn't move, his fingers clenching around Rocky's leash as the dog let out another sharp, low growl. Mike stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his face twisted into a crooked grin, like he was enjoying this far too much. "Listen, kid," Mike said, his voice smooth and mocking. "I ain't looking for trouble. Just asking about that nice backpack of yours. What's in it, huh? A laptop? Bet it's worth something." Jamal's heart hammered in his chest. He took a small step back, pulling Rocky closer. "I'm not telling you anything," he said firmly, trying to keep his voice steady. Mike tilted his head, his grin twitching wider. "Come on now. Don't be like that. I'm just asking a question." Rocky growled louder, his sharp eyes locked on the man. The tension in the air was thick, every movement feeling exaggerated and slow. "You need to leave," Jamal said, louder this time. I'll call the police if you don't." Mike froze for a beat. Then he let out a laugh, short and cruel, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "The police?" he scoffed. "Go ahead. Call 'em. See if I care." Jamal swallowed, his fingers shaking slightly around Rocky's leash. "I mean it," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "They'll come, and you'll get in trouble." Mike's expression shifted, his grin fading as his tone turned colder. "No, they won't," he said flatly, his eyes narrowing. "You think they care about some kid and a dog? They'll tell you to go home, and that'll be the end of it. Trust me." Jamal blinked, stunned silent for a moment. "That's not true," he said, though the confidence was slipping from his voice. Mike stepped forward, just a little. "You sure about that? You think they're gonna waste their time on you?" Rocky barked sharply, the sound cutting through the man's words like a knife. Mike flinched slightly, his gaze flicking to the snarling dog before returning to Jamal. "Call whoever you want," he said, his voice calm again, though there was a bitter edge to it. "But that bag's comin' with me one way or another." Jamal's heart dropped. He knew then. Mike wasn't walking away. "You're not getting it," Jamal snapped, his voice shaking but defiant. "You're not." Mike's grin returned, twisted and cruel. "You think you're gonna stop me? You're just a scared little boy." Rocky barked again, louder this time, and lunged forward just enough to make Mike flinch. Jamal held tight to the leash, his own chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "You need to leave us alone," Jamal said again, his voice louder. "This is your last chance." Mike shook his head slowly, his hands slipping deeper into his jacket pockets as he started to pace again. He circled them, moving in wide, deliberate steps, like a predator testing its prey. "I told you, kid," Mike said, his voice dropping to a dangerous mutter. "This ain't about what you want. It's about what I'm taking." Jamal turned to keep him in view, his pulse pounding in his ears. "People are gonna see you," he said quickly, the words tumbling out. "You can't do this." "You'll get caught," Mike snorted. "Ain't nobody around to see nothin'," he said, his gaze flicking up and down the quiet street, "and no one's gonna care. That's how it works." Jamal's jaw tightened, His mind raced, desperate for something, anything, to get this man to leave. "Rocky will bite you," he warned, pulling the leash taut as the dog snarled. Mike stopped pacing for a moment, his eyes narrowing at Rocky. "Maybe he will," he muttered, his voice low, almost to himself. "But dogs get tired, don't they?" Jamal didn't answer. The weight of the man's words sank deep, and for the first time, real panic started to creep up inside him. He gripped the backpack strap on his shoulder, as if holding onto it might keep Mike away. Mike watched him carefully, like he could see the fear bubbling beneath Jamal's stubborn expression. "Don't make this harder on yourself, kid," he said softly, almost a whisper. "Just give me the bag, and I'll walk away. Easy as that." Jamal shook his head. "No." Mike's mouth twitched in irritation. "Fine," he said, the word clipped and sharp. "Have it your way." The man's posture shifted, his hands sliding out of his jacket pockets. He rolled his shoulders like he was warming up for a fight, his grin gone now, replaced with a cold, focused stare. Jamal felt Rocky tense beside him, the growls rolling through the dog's body like a storm about to break. The moment hung heavy in the air, silent except for Rocky's snarl and Jamal's quick, uneven breathing. Mike's eyes darted to the backpack one last time. Then, without another word, he lunged forward. Amal jerked back, stumbling a step as he yanked the bag out of reach. "Rocky!" Jamal yelled. The dog exploded into motion. Rocky lunged, snarling and barking with teeth bared, his body a blur of muscle and fury. Mike recoiled, cursing loudly as he staggered back, barely dodging Rocky's snapping jaws. "Get back, you stupid dog!" Mike shouted, his voice laced with panic as he stumbled further away. Rocky snapped at him again, the leash taut in Jamal's hands as the dog strained to reach him. Jamal felt his grip slipping. The leash burned against his fingers as Rocky tugged harder, desperate to close the gap. Mike cursed again, stumbling over his own feet as he tried to sidestep the dog. "Control that mutt!" he roared, his voice cracking with frustration. "You need to leave us alone!" Jamal shouted, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. Mike's face contorted with rage. "You're gonna regret this, kid," he spat, but his voice wavered as Rocky lunged again, teeth flashing. The dog's ferocity sent him scrambling backward. In that moment, Jamal's fingers slipped. The leash flew out of his hands. "Rocky! No!" Jamal gasped. But the German shepherd was already charging. Rocky's bark echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a warning shot. Mike let out a yell, stumbling as he turned and bolted down the sidewalk. "Get away!" he shouted, his voice breaking. Rocky gave chase, his paws pounding the pavement as he tore after the man, his barking relentless. Mike ran clumsily, arms flailing, as he glanced back in terror at the dog closing the distance. Jamal's heart raced. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. "Rocky, come back!" he shouted, his voice high with panic. But Rocky didn't stop. Jamal turned and ran. His sneakers slapped against the pavement as he sprinted in the opposite direction, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders with every step. The quiet neighborhood blurred around him. Fences, mailboxes, trees, none of it mattered. He just needed to get away. "Rocky!" he yelled over his shoulder as he ran, his chest burning with effort. The barking grew fainter now, farther behind him, and Jamal's stomach twisted with fear. What if Rocky got hurt? What if Mike did something to him? Jamal turned the corner at the end of the block and stopped, gasping for air as he doubled over, his hands on his knees. The world spun slightly, his heart hammering in his chest. He stood up quickly, turning back to look down the street he'd just run from. For a long, horrible moment, all he heard was silence. No barking, no shouting, nothing. Then, finally, Rocky appeared. The German shepherd came tearing around the corner, his tongue hanging out, and his tail wagging wildly as he ran straight for Jamal. "Rocky!" Jamal called, relief flooding through him as he knelt down. The dog skidded to a stop in front of him, panting hard but unharmed. "You're okay," Jamal breathed, throwing his arms around Rocky's neck. Rocky barked softly, as if to reassure him. Jamal held on tightly, burying his face in the dog's thick fur as his body trembled from the adrenaline still coursing through him. He pulled back after a moment, running his hands over Rocky to check for any injuries. "You scared me, boy," he whispered. "I thought," he trailed off, shaking his head. Rocky licked his face once, then sat at attention, ears alert as he scanned the street. Jamal stood up slowly, his legs still shaky. He looked back down the empty road where Mike had run. There was no sign of him now. No movement, no sound, but Jamal's backpack and the school laptop inside were still safe on his shoulders. He exhaled shakily, patting Rocky's head. "Come on, let's get out of here," he said softly. With Rocky at his side, they began to run quickly down the sidewalk, Jamal's head turning every few steps to make sure the man wasn't coming back. The quiet neighborhood that had always felt so safe now seemed eerie. Too empty. Too still. Jamal's pulse still raced, but he kept moving, one hand resting on Rocky's back as if to steady himself. "We're gonna be okay," Jamal murmured, more to himself than to Rocky. Rocky barked once, low and steady, as if he agreed, but Jamal knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Mike was still lurking, and Jamal was sure of one thing. Next time, the man wouldn't back down so easily. Jamal's chest still heaved as he slowed to a walk. His legs burned, and his breath came in shallow gasps. But Rocky kept moving, ears alert and nose twitching. The two had made it a few blocks away, cutting through quiet side streets. "We're okay now, right, boy?" Jamal muttered, though his voice shook. Rocky glanced up at him but growled softly in response, a low rumble that sent chills down Jamal's spine. The dog was still on edge. Jamal turned to look over his shoulder again, but the street behind them was empty. He exhaled, the tension still heavy on his chest. "We're fine," he whispered, more to himself than Rocky. Then Rocky's body stiffened. "Rocky?" Jamal asked, his voice barely audible. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Before he could react, a voice sliced through the stillness like a knife. "You really thought you could get away, kid?" Jamal spun around just as Mike stepped out from between two houses, his face red and furious. His jacket was still torn from earlier, but this time there was no smugness, just anger. Jamal stumbled back a step, gripping Rocky's leash tightly. "Leave us alone!" Mike ignored him, his eyes fixed on the backpack. "I told you I was getting that bag," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You just had to make it difficult." Rocky lunged forward, snarling and barking, pulling so hard against the leash that Jamal almost lost his grip. "Rocky, no!" he shouted, struggling to hold the dog back. Mike flinched for half a second, but didn't stop moving. "That dog ain't gonna save you this time." He stepped closer, circling Jamal slowly, his eyes sharp and calculating. Jamal backed away, every nerve screaming at him to run, but he knew Mike would chase him down again. "I'll call the police!" Jamal shouted, desperation cracking through his voice. Mike laughed harshly, his eyes flashing with something cruel. "Go ahead, call them. You think they care? By the time they get here, I'll be long gone, and you'll be sitting there crying without your fancy laptop." Jamal's heart pounded. "You're not taking it!" "Wanna bet?" Mike snapped, lunging forward suddenly. Rocky barked furiously and leapt at him, but Jamal wasn't ready. The leash tore free from his grip as Mike grabbed the strap of Jamal's backpack, yanking it hard. "Let go!" Jamal shouted, twisting and pulling back, but Mike was stronger. The man jerked hard, the force almost knocking Jamal off his feet. "I said it's mine!" Mike snarled through gritted teeth, his face inches from Jamal's as he ripped the bag away. "Rocky!" Jamal screamed. Rocky lunged again, teeth snapping at Mike's arm. The dog clamped onto his torn jacket, growling and thrashing as Mike swore loudly, trying to shake him off. "Get off me, you stupid mutt!" he shouted, his voice panicked now. Jamal took the opportunity to grab the bag, his fingers catching one of the straps, but Mike shoved him hard. Jamal hit the ground, his palms scraping painfully against the pavement. For a split second, everything froze. Rocky's snarling filled the air, his teeth still tearing at Mike's jacket. But Mike grunted and swung his arm hard, knocking the dog loose. Rocky stumbled back with a yelp, just enough for Mike to stagger free. Jamal's eyes widened as Mike straightened, clutching the backpack tightly against his chest. The man's face was flushed, his breaths ragged, but the grin was back, cold and triumphant. "I told you!" Mike hissed, stepping back. "This was mine!" Rocky barked furiously again, but Mike didn't stick around this time. He turned and bolted, sprinting down the street, the torn jacket flapping behind him as he clutched the stolen bag. "Rocky, come back!" Jamal yelled, as the dog took off after him, barking wildly. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his scraped hands stinging, his chest tight with panic. "Rocky, stop!" Rocky didn't stop. The dog chased after Mike, his barks echoing down the block, but Mike was too far ahead. Jamal stumbled a few steps forward, his breath shaky as he watched Mike disappear around the corner with the backpack. "Rocky!" Jamal called again. The dog stopped at the edge of the block, barking at the empty street where Mike had vanished. Slowly, reluctantly, Rocky turned back. His tail was low, his ears pinned back, as if he knew he hadn't won. Jamal wiped his face with the back of his arm, his hands trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. The backpack was gone. The laptop. Everything. Gone. Rocky trotted back to him, panting hard, and Jamal sank down onto the curb again, his legs feeling weak. Rocky sat beside him, letting out a soft whine as he nudged Jamal's arm with his nose. "I'm sorry, boy," Jamal whispered, his voice hoarse. He ran a shaky hand over Rocky's back, trying to steady himself. The street felt colder now, emptier somehow, like the world had shifted in a way Jamal couldn't explain. He stared at the corner where Mike had disappeared, his chest tightening with anger and frustration. He wiped his face again and looked down at Rocky. "We're gonna get it back," he muttered, his voice shaking but determined. "I don't care what it takes." Rocky barked softly, as if in agreement. Jamal stood up, brushing dirt from his scraped knees, and looked toward the street where Mike had run. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jamal sprinted down the sidewalk, his legs aching and lungs burning. But he didn't stop. Rocky ran alongside him, panting hard, his ears pinned back as if he, too, felt the urgency. Every few steps, Jamal glanced over his shoulder, half expecting Mike to reappear, charging after them. The quiet of the neighborhood felt unreal now, its familiar calm turned into something eerie and suffocating. Jamal's scraped palms stung, and the tears of frustration he'd fought back earlier blurred his vision as he pushed himself harder. Finally, he turned the corner onto his street. The sight of his house, small and sturdy with its peeling front steps, filled him with relief and dread at the same time. His dad, David, was standing on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, squinting toward the sidewalk. He'd been looking around, confused, as if he'd already heard something unusual. When he saw Jamal running full speed toward him, with Rocky at his side and panic etched on his face, David straightened immediately. "Jamal!" he called out, his deep voice sharp with concern. "What's going on?" Jamal didn't slow down until he reached the bottom of the porch steps, skidding to a stop as Rocky trotted to his side, still panting. Jamal bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. David was off the porch in seconds. "Jamal, what happened? Why are you running like that?" Jamal looked up, his face flushed and streaked with sweat. He stole it, Dad," he choked out, his voice shaky. "The man, he took my backpack." David's eyes widened. "What man?" "A man followed me. He grabbed my bag. He took my laptop." Jamal's words tumbled out so fast they ran together. He held out his scraped hands, proof of the struggle. As Rocky let out a low whine beside him, David's face darkened, his brow furrowing deeply. "Hold on. Start from the beginning. Someone stole your backpack?" Jamal nodded rapidly, fighting to catch his breath. "Yeah. He came out of nowhere and started following me. I told him to leave us alone, but he wouldn't." Rocky tried to stop him. He chased him. "But he got my bag, Dad." The laptop, everything. David knelt down to look Jamal in the eye, his hands firm on Jamal's shoulders. Did he hurt you? Are you okay? Jamal wiped his face with the back of his arm and nodded shakily. I'm okay. Rocky scared him, but he still got away. David's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked to Rocky, who sat beside Jamal, still alert, his ears twitching as he scanned the street. And this guy, he just followed you? Tried to grab you? No, not me. Just the bag, Jamal said, frustration bubbling in his voice. He said nobody would care. He said the police wouldn't help me. David's face darkened further at that. He stood up slowly, his expression like a storm brewing. He said that, huh? Jamal nodded, clenching his fists. He didn't even care about Rocky. He just kept coming until he got the bag. David looked down the street, his eyes narrowing as if he could still see the thief lurking somewhere in the distance. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he turned back to Jamal, his voice low and steady. This isn't over. You hear me? Jamal blinked up at him. What? David's jaw was set, his voice firm. We're not gonna let this man get away with stealing from you. We're calling the police. I don't care what he said. You don't let someone like that just walk away. Jamal hesitated, doubt creeping in. But he said they wouldn't help. David crouched down again, his gaze serious. I don't care what he said. You don't let a thief decide what's going to happen next. You stand up for yourself. You understand me? Jamal stared at his father for a moment, then nodded slowly. David looked at Rocky, who sat at attention as if he already knew what was coming. Rocky did his part. Now it's our turn. Jamal wiped his face again, the anger in his chest settling into something sharper, something focused. Okay, he said quietly. David stood, pulling his phone out of his pocket as he gestured toward the house. Let's get you cleaned up. Then we're calling this in. Jamal followed him up the porch steps, Rocky trotting close beside him. The dog paused once at the top, turning to glance back down the empty street with a low growl, as if he could still smell the thief somewhere nearby. Jamal glanced back too, his fists tightening at his sides. This isn't over, he thought. Jamal sat at the dining room table, his scraped palms stinging from the antiseptic his dad had applied. Rocky lay at his feet, still alert, ears twitching at every sound. Across the room, David paced, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tense and clipped. Yeah, my son was followed, threatened and robbed, David said sharply into the phone. The guy got away with his school laptop. What else do you need to know? Jamal watched his dad's movements closely, picking up the frustration in his voice. He could only hear one side of the conversation, but it didn't sound good. No, we don't know him, David continued, his jaw tight. He's white, mid-30s, scruffy, and wearing a ripped jacket now. My son had to let his dog go to stop him, and that still wasn't enough. Jamal bit his lip, his stomach twisting. He knew what was coming even before David's voice rose. You're telling me this ain't serious? You got a man stalking a kid and stealing from him, and you're saying you'll send someone when you get a chance? David stopped pacing, his free hand curling into a fist. That's not good enough. Send someone now. There was a pause. Jamal couldn't hear what the dispatcher said, but it wasn't what David wanted to hear. No, we're not just letting this go, David said, his voice low and firm. He hung up without another word, exhaling through his nose as he ran a hand over his face. Jamal sat up straighter, his heart sinking. What did they say? David looked at him, his expression hard. They're sending someone to take a report. That's all. Jamal frowned. So, they're not gonna do anything? David shook his head. We'll see, but don't hold your breath. 15 minutes later, a squad car pulled up outside. Jamal watched from the window as a single officer stepped out. A tall, middle-aged man with a bored expression and sunglasses perched on his head. He walked toward the porch like he had all the time in the world. David opened the door before the man could knock. You're here about my son? Yeah, the officer replied flatly, pulling out a small notebook. Got a call about a stolen backpack and a dog incident? David's jaw tightened. Not just a backpack. A man followed my son, threatened him, and stole his school laptop. He was chased off by my son's dog. You see the difference? The officer shrugged slightly, flipping his notebook open. All right, let's hear what happened. Start from the beginning. Jamal hesitated as David turned to him. Tell him, his dad said gently. Jamal stepped forward, his voice small at first, as he recounted the entire incident, how Mike had followed him, taunted him, dismissed the police, and finally taken the backpack after a struggle. He described Mike's appearance as best as he could. White, mid-30s, scruffy beard, torn jacket, and dirty boots. Rocky sat by Jamal's side the whole time, staring intently at the officer as if he understood exactly who they were talking about. When Jamal finished, the officer scribbled a few notes, nodding like he'd heard it all before. Okay, he said finally, tucking the notebook back into his pocket. I'll file the report. David's eyebrows shot up. That's it? The officer looked at him, his expression still indifferent. We'll keep an eye out, but don't count on much happening. Guy like that probably doesn't have a fixed address. If he's moving through the area, he's long gone by now. Jamal blinked, his chest tightening. You're saying you're not gonna find him? The officer sighed. Look, kid, it's not that simple. It's a stolen backpack. Nobody got seriously hurt, right? He gestured toward Rocky with a hint of a smile. Your dog did good. If he comes back or you see him again, give us a call. David stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. That's all you've got? He followed my son, threatened him and robbed him, and you're calling it a stolen backpack? The officer raised a hand as if to calm him. I get you're upset, but this kind of thing happens. We'll file it, but honestly, I wouldn't expect much. Sorry, but that's just how it is. David's face was stone as he opened the door wider. Thanks for stopping by, officer. The officer paused as if he might say more, but decided against it. With a nod, he turned and walked back to his car. Jamal watched through the window as the squad car pulled away, leaving the street empty once again. The knot in his stomach grew tighter. So, they're really not gonna help? He said quietly. David didn't answer right away. He stood at the window for a long moment, staring out at the empty street. When he finally turned back to Jamal, his face was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. Fine, he said, his voice low but steady. If they won't do anything, we will. Jamal looked up at him, his pulse quickening. How? David rested a hand on Rocky's head, the dog looking up at him like he was ready for whatever came next. We're gonna find this guy ourselves. He messed with the wrong family. Rocky barked softly, his tail wagging once, as if he understood. Jamal wiped his hands on his jeans, a new sense of resolve rising in his chest. Let's do it then. David gave him a small nod. Get ready, son. We're gonna track him down. The sun was dipping lower, bathing the neighborhood in an orange glow, as David and Jamal walked briskly down Maple Street. Rocky trotted at Jamal's side, his nose close to the ground, his body still tense and alert. We'll start where it happened, David said, his voice steady and low. You said he ran toward the construction site? Yeah, Jamal replied, glancing nervously at the empty road ahead. It's where I lost sight of him. David's eyes narrowed as he scanned the street. People like him don't just vanish. If he ran through here, he left something behind. They crossed over to the construction site, a sprawling lot of half-built houses, stacks of lumber, and quiet, unfinished roads. The wind rustled through plastic tarps, the sound unnerving in the silence. Stay close, David said, as they stepped onto the dirt path. Keep Rocky focused. Rocky's ears perked up as his nose worked the ground. Jamal tightened his grip on the leash, his heart still racing from earlier. He glanced at his dad. You think he's still here? David shook his head. No, guys like him don't stick to one spot. This isn't his home. He's just passing through. If we're lucky, we'll find a clue about where he's headed. They walked carefully, moving past piles of wood and tools left scattered on the ground. Rocky suddenly barked, loud and sharp, making Jamal jump. The German shepherd tugged forward, his nose pointing toward the side of a partially built house. What is it, boy? David muttered, his voice low but focused. Rocky led them to the edge of the building, where tire tracks cut deep into the dirt, leading out of the site. A crumpled soda can sat nearby, along with a cigarette butt ground into the mud. David crouched to inspect it, his jaw tightening. "These tracks are fresh," he said. "They weren't here yesterday." He pointed at the footprints scattered around the area, clear boot marks leading toward and away from the road. Jamal frowned. "You think that's him?" "Yeah," David replied grimly. "He was here, probably cutting through. But look at this." He stood up and pointed to the tire marks. "He's not on foot. Someone picked him up, or he's got a car parked close by. This guy's got somewhere to go." Jamal swallowed hard, trying to piece it together. "So he's not just hiding here?" David shook his head. "No, he's smart enough to move. He used this spot to lay low after he ran. But he's not some drifter. He's local, someone who knows these streets and isn't afraid to use them." Jamal's stomach twisted. "That's worse." David looked at him, his face hard but reassuring. "It means we'll find him. He's staying close, and when someone like him gets too confident, that's when they make mistakes." Rocky barked again, sniffing along the ground near the tracks, his nose twitching furiously. Jamal knelt down beside him, running a hand over Rocky's back. "Good boy," he whispered. David glanced down the street, his eyes sharp as he scanned the quiet houses lining the block. "The construction site gives us a direction. He's either parked nearby or staying close enough that he didn't need to go far. So what do we do now?" Jamal asked, his voice steadier now. David straightened, brushing dust from his knees. "We're gonna let the police know what we found, but we'll come back tomorrow. If he's as confident as he thinks he is, he might pass through again, and we'll be ready." Jamal nodded, determination flaring in his chest. He tightened his grip on Rocky's leash and looked down the empty road. "We'll catch him, Dad. He's not getting away with it." David smiled faintly, his expression proud but still hard-edged. "That's right, he messed with the wrong kid." Rocky barked once, his body still alert, as if he could sense that something wasn't finished. Jamal glanced one last time at the tire tracks and boot marks, anger bubbling beneath his skin. The man thought no one would care, that he could just take what wasn't his and disappear. But he was wrong. The next day, Jamal and David were back on the streets, this time with a clear purpose. The morning air was crisp, and the neighborhood was already alive with the sound of cars and distant lawnmowers. But the weight of what they were doing made everything feel sharper, more deliberate. David walked ahead, his eyes scanning every driveway and every street corner like a man on a mission. Jamal held Rocky's leash, staying close, his heart pounding as they retraced Mike's escape route from the day before. "You sure he went this way, Dad?" Jamal asked quietly, glancing up and down the rows of houses. David nodded without looking back. "If he's local like I think he is, he didn't go far. He slipped into a spot he knows, someplace familiar. You just keep an eye out." They turned off Maple Street, the path now taking them deeper into a quieter part of the neighborhood. The houses here were smaller, older, some of them in need of repair. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the sidewalks, and rusted mailboxes leaned crookedly against posts. Rocky's ears twitched as he tugged gently on the leash, sniffing the ground more intently now. Jamal's stomach twisted. It felt like Rocky knew something, sensed something. David paused at the end of the block, squinting toward a small, weathered house near the corner. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling on the shutters, and an old sedan sat in the driveway with a layer of dust clinging to it. Jamal followed his dad's gaze, and his heart dropped. "That's it, isn't it?" Jamal whispered, tightening his grip on Rocky's leash. David didn't answer right away. He was staring at the car parked halfway up the driveway. The boot prints they'd seen in the construction site had matched, deep and uneven, and now there they were again, faint in the dirt leading to the porch. "Yeah," David muttered finally, his jaw tightening. "This is it." Rocky let out a low growl, his nose twitching as he stared at the house. Jamal shivered. Even from the street, the place felt wrong. "What do we do?" Jamal asked, his voice low. David turned to look at his son, his face calm but serious. "We don't confront him, that's what. We're not taking risks. This isn't someone you walk up to and reason with." Jamal frowned. "But we found him." We know where he is. Shouldn't we do something? David shook his head firmly. We are doing something. We're going to the police station, and this time, they're gonna have to listen. Jamal's chest tightened as he looked back at the house. A curtain in one of the windows shifted slightly, as though someone inside had just stepped away. He swallowed hard. What if they still don't care? David rested a hand on Jamal's shoulder. They'll care this time. We're not leaving without making them. Jamal nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what his dad was saying. This wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, it felt like they were closing in. Come on, David said, turning away from the house. We're going to the station. They headed back the way they'd come, moving quickly now, Rocky's paws tapping against the pavement as he stayed close to Jamal's side. Jamal couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, half expecting Mike to come charging out of the house, but the street remained still. The inside of the police station felt cold and sterile, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint smell of stale coffee hanging in the air. David marched straight to the front desk, where a young officer sat behind a computer, barely glancing up. Can I help you? The officer asked flatly. Yes, David said firmly. I called yesterday about my son being robbed. We found the guy. That got the officer's attention. He sat up straighter. You found him? David nodded. We know where he is. We found his house. He's local, just like I said. He's staying on Maple Street, near the corner of Pine. The officer frowned slightly, typing something into the computer. Did you see him? David glanced at Jamal, then back at the officer. We didn't confront him, but we know it's him. Boot prints, the direction he ran. It all adds up. Jamal shifted nervously as Rocky sat beside him, panting quietly. The room felt too still, like they were waiting for someone to dismiss them again. The officer looked at David for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Sit tight. I'll let someone know. David's face remained calm, but Jamal could see the tension in his posture. No, David said, his voice steady. We're not leaving until you send someone to check that house. The officer blinked, clearly caught off guard. Sir, I can't. You can. David interrupted. You will. My son was followed, threatened, and robbed, and we just handed you this man's location. You have no excuses now. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the back of the station where another officer, a senior one, by the look of it, was walking past. The younger officer stood quickly, flagging him down. Sergeant, can you take this? It's about the report from yesterday, he said, his voice tight. The sergeant, an older man with graying hair, listened as David repeated everything. The robbery, Mike's escape, the clues they'd pieced together, and the house they'd found. The sergeant scratched his chin, then nodded once. All right. I'll send someone over to take a look. David stared him down. Don't just look. This guy needs to be held accountable. The sergeant met David's gaze. We'll handle it. Go home and wait for an update. David didn't look satisfied, but he nodded. We'll be waiting. Jamal followed his dad and Rocky back outside, the cold air feeling sharper than before. As they walked to the car, Jamal glanced up at David. Do you think they'll really do something this time? David exhaled slowly, his face hard. They have to. And if they don't, we'll make sure they don't forget about it. Jamal nodded, his grip on Rocky's leash firm. We're not letting him get away. David smiled faintly. That's right. Rocky barked softly, his tail wagging once as they climbed into the car. The drive home from the police station was quiet, the weight of the day settling over them like a thick fog. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as they passed rows of houses bathed in the soft orange glow of evening. David's hands gripped the steering wheel, his face set in hard concentration. We did what we needed to do, he said finally, his voice low. It's in their hands now. Jamal nodded slowly, though the doubt still gnawed at him. What if they don't find him? David exhaled through his nose, glancing at Jamal. We'll deal with that when we have to, but they've got the address now. That's more than we had before. Rocky sat in the back seat, his head poking between them, as if he could feel the tension in the car. When they pulled into the driveway, the street was quiet, just as it had been that morning. Jamal climbed out of the car, his legs stiff, and followed his dad and Rocky inside. Inside the house, the silence was heavy. Jamal sank onto the couch, Rocky curling up at his feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. He absent-mindedly ran his hands through the dog's fur, staring at nothing in particular. David settled into the armchair across from him, elbows on his knees, watching the phone on the coffee table as if he expected it to ring any second. The seconds dragged into minutes. The clock in the living room ticked loudly, filling the quiet space. Jamal's mind raced as he replayed everything. Mike's twisted grin, the way he'd ripped the backpack away, and the feeling of helplessness that followed. "They'll show up, right?" Jamal asked finally, breaking the silence. David looked up, his face calm but tired. "They said they'd check it out. If they find him, they'll call." Jamal frowned. "But what if he's not there?" David's jaw tightened, his voice steady but firm. "Then we keep pushing." "But let's not go there yet." Jamal tried to believe him, but Mike's mocking words kept ringing in his ears. "They won't care." The sharp knock on the front door made both of them jump. Rocky barked, leaping to his feet, his deep, sharp barks echoing through the house. Jamal's pulse spiked as he stood quickly, his heart thudding against his ribs. David was already on his feet, striding to the door. He paused just long enough to glance back at Jamal. "Stay here." Jamal hovered near the couch as David opened the door. A police officer stood there, tall, stocky, and different from the one who'd taken their report earlier. His uniform was crisp, his notebook in hand, but his expression was hard to read. "Mr. Turner?" the officer asked, his voice steady. "Yeah," David replied, his tone firm. "What's the update?" The officer glanced down at his notebook, flipping it shut with a sigh. "We checked the address you gave us." David's shoulders squared. "And?" The officer looked up, his face impassive. "No one was home." Jamal's stomach dropped, his fists clenching at his sides. Rocky let out a low growl, as if echoing Jamal's frustration. "No one was—" David cut himself off, his voice sharp. "That's it? That's all you've got?" The officer shifted slightly, tucking the notebook under his arm. "We did a sweep of the property. Car in the driveway was cold. Hadn't been driven recently. No sign of anyone there." Jamal stepped closer. "But he was there. You saw the house. The boot prints. We're not making this up." The officer looked at Jamal, his expression softening slightly. "I'm not saying you are, kid. But if he's not there, we can't arrest him. We'll file this report and keep the address on record. If he shows up again, let us know." David's voice turned cold. "That's it? You're just going to wait for him to show up again?" The officer held up a hand as if to calm him. "I understand this is frustrating, Mr. Turner, but right now, we don't have much to go on. No one saw him go inside. Unless we catch him in the act or someone comes forward with more information, there's not much we can do." Jamal's face burned. "But he stole from me." The officer nodded, his voice softer now. "I know, and I'm sorry. We'll keep an eye out, but I can't promise more than that." David stood still for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the officer. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Fine. Thanks for coming by." The officer gave a quick nod before turning and walking back to his car. The sound of the engine starting felt like a slap against the silence that followed. David shut the door with more force than necessary, his shoulders tense as he turned back to Jamal. "So that's it?" Jamal muttered, anger bubbling in his chest. "They're just done?" David ran a hand over his face, his voice low but steady. "No, we're not done." Jamal looked up, his eyes meeting his dad's. "What do we do now?" David exhaled slowly, looking down at Rocky, who was pacing restlessly. "We keep watching. He'll come back, Jamal. People like him always think they're untouchable. And when he does—" Jamal nodded, the anger sharpening into something more determined. "We'll be ready." Rocky barked softly, his tail wagging once as he sat beside Jamal, eyes fixed on the door, as if waiting for the next step. The week had crawled by slowly, each day weighed down by frustration and unanswered questions. Jamal still couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was out there, lurking just around the corner, smug and unbothered. David remained calm, but Jamal knew his dad was watching the neighborhood just as closely as he was. People like him think no one's looking. David had said one evening, but they always slip up. That Saturday afternoon felt like any other. The sun was bright, and the air warm as Jamal walked Rocky down the sidewalk beside his dad. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. "Stay sharp, son," David said quietly as they moved down Maple Street. "You never know." Jamal nodded, keeping his eyes on Rocky, who sniffed the ground with purpose. Then it happened. Rocky froze. The leash jerked tight in Jamal's hand as the dog's entire body went rigid, ears perked, and nose twitching furiously. Jamal felt it immediately. A change in the air, a crackling tension that made his heart skip a beat. "Rocky?" Jamal whispered, frowning. Before he could say another word, Rocky growled, a deep, primal sound that sent a chill up Jamal's spine, and then bolted. "Rocky!" Jamal shouted as the leash ripped free from his grip. The dog sprinted forward like a flash of lightning, barking furiously as he tore across the street and around the corner. "Stay with him!" David barked, already breaking into a run. Jamal didn't hesitate. He sprinted after Rocky, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. He could hear David close behind, but all he could focus on was Rocky's barking, sharp and relentless, echoing off the houses. As Jamal rounded the corner, he saw him, Mike. The man was running full speed down the sidewalk, clutching Jamal's backpack tightly against his chest. His jacket flapped as he ran, his head whipping around to glance back at the furious German shepherd gaining on him. "Rocky!" Jamal screamed, his legs burning as he pushed himself to keep up. Mike darted into a narrow alley between two houses, his footsteps pounding wildly against the pavement. Rocky followed without hesitation, barking like thunder as he closed the distance. "Keep moving, Jamal!" David shouted from behind, his voice urgent. Jamal pumped his arms harder, turning into the alley just in time to see Mike shove a trash can into Rocky's path. The metal can clanged loudly as it toppled over, but Rocky barely slowed down, leaping over the debris and continuing the chase. Mike cursed loudly, his steps growing clumsy as panic overtook him. "Get off me, you stupid dog!" Mike yelled, his voice cracking. Jamal stumbled around the corner of the alley, his lungs screaming for air as he tried to catch up. But Mike was fast, weaving through the alley and cutting around fences, his figure growing smaller with every step. Rocky didn't let up. "Rocky's right on him, Dad!" Jamal shouted breathlessly, glancing back as David rounded the corner, his face set in grim focus. David nodded sharply. "Don't lose sight of them!" But that was easier said than done. Mike turned sharply at the end of the alley, ducking through an opening in a rusted chain-link fence. Rocky shot through the gap right after him, barking furiously as the sound echoed into the next street. "Rocky!" Jamal shouted, sprinting harder. David reached him just as they skidded to a stop at the end of the alley, where the fence stood between them and the empty lot beyond. "Where'd they go?" Jamal gasped, scanning frantically. David's eyes darted around the area, his jaw clenched. "They're close. Rocky won't let him get far." Rocky's barking rang out again, this time deeper into the lot, louder and more urgent. "Come on," David said, pulling Jamal through the gap in the fence. "We're catching up." Jamal's heart thundered as they hurried through the uneven lot, past overgrown weeds and broken concrete. He could still hear Rocky's bark, relentless, unyielding, and it gave him hope. Then, suddenly, the barking stopped. Jamal froze, his chest heaving as he turned to David. "Rocky!" David grabbed Jamal's shoulder, steadying him. "We're close. Keep moving." They broke into a jog, weaving around piles of debris, the silence now heavier than ever. Jamal's mind raced with possibilities. And then they saw it. Ahead of them, near the edge of the lot, Rocky's figure came into view, low and still, his back arched and muscles coiled. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. "He's got him!" David slowed, his voice low and firm. "Stay behind me." Jamal nodded, clutching the backpack straps tightly as they moved forward, step by step, toward the scene unfolding before them. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he and David closed in on the overgrown lot. The silence after Rocky's barking was deafening, every step feeling like it stretched into forever. "There he is," David muttered, his voice low and steady, pointing ahead. Jamal squinted through the tall weeds and broken concrete. That's when he saw them. Rocky stood like a statue, low, tense, and poised, his teeth bared and his deep growl vibrating through the air. Just a few feet away, sprawled on the ground, was Mike. His jacket was dirty, and his face was twisted in panic as he pressed his back against a rusted metal dumpster, trying to edge away without success. "Get him away!" Mike shouted, his voice frantic as he threw a hand up defensively. "Call him off, man!" David stepped forward first, his presence commanding, as Jamal followed closely behind, clutching his backpack straps tightly. "You're pinned," David said calmly, his voice carrying all the weight of finality. Rocky didn't move. He stayed crouched, every muscle in his body taut, his growl unrelenting. Mike didn't dare try to stand up, his wild eyes flicking between Rocky and David. "Call him back!" Mike yelled, his voice cracking. "I didn't do nothing!" "You didn't do nothing," David repeated coldly, stepping closer as Jamal hovered behind him. "You've been running long enough. We know what you did." Mike's hands shot up in a pathetic attempt to calm the moment. "I didn't mean to. Look, it's just a bag. You don't gotta make a scene over it." Jamal stepped out from behind his father then, his voice loud and clear. "It wasn't just a bag. You stole my school laptop. You followed me. You threatened me. And now you're caught," Rocky barked sharply, making Mike flinch hard. "Get him back. I'll give it back, all right?" David shook his head, his tone icy. Too late for that. He pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up. "I'm calling the police. This ends now." Mike's expression turned desperate, his eyes darting wildly. "Wait! Wait! You don't need to do that, man." "I'll leave. I'll disappear. You won't see me again." David ignored him, already dialing. "You had your chances." Jamal watched as Mike's face fell, his bravado completely gone. He was cornered, pinned both by Rocky's silent fury and the presence of Jamal and his father. "Yeah, I've got him," David said into the phone, his voice calm but firm. "We've got the guy who robbed my son. He's pinned. Send someone to the lot off Maple and Pine. Now." Rocky growled again as Mike shifted slightly, his back pressed even harder against the dumpster. Jamal couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched the man who had mocked him now cowering like a trapped rat. "You're done running," David said sharply as he hung up the phone. Mike glared up at him, trying to muster some bravado. "You think they're gonna care? You think they'll listen to you?" "They will this time," David shot back, stepping closer. "Because we're not letting it drop." Jamal crouched beside Rocky, running his hand over the dog's back. "Good boy," he whispered softly, pride swelling in his chest. Rocky wagged his tail once but didn't move, keeping his sharp eyes fixed on Mike. The distant sound of sirens began to build, faint but growing louder. Mike's face drained of color. "Man, come on," he begged, his voice breaking. "It's just a stupid bag. You don't have to ruin my life over this." Jamal looked him square in the eye, his voice calm but full of conviction. "You did that yourself." Mike's mouth opened to respond, but the wail of sirens cut him off. He slumped against the dumpster, defeated, as the flashing blue and red lights reflected off the rusted metal. "Here they come," David said, stepping back and resting a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder. "It's over." Rocky barked one last time, loud and clear, as if declaring victory. Jamal stood up, his fists finally unclenching, as the police cars pulled up and officers emerged with urgency in their steps. "There!" David called to them, gesturing toward Mike. "That's your man." One officer approached cautiously, glancing at Rocky with admiration. "Nice dog," he muttered before gesturing for Mike to stand up. "Get up," the officer barked, grabbing Mike by the arm as he hauled him to his feet. Mike didn't resist. He looked hollow now, all fight drained from him. He kept his head low as the officers cuffed his hands behind his back. "You're gonna regret this," he muttered bitterly, not looking at anyone. David snorted quietly. "I doubt it." Jamal watched in silence as the officers led Mike toward one of the squad cars, his feet shuffling against the pavement. It was over. As the police car pulled away, Jamal turned to Rocky, crouching beside him again. "You did it, boy," he said with a grin, scratching behind Rocky's ears. "You're the best." Rocky wagged his tail proudly, his tongue hanging out as if smiling back at Jamal. David placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, giving it a small squeeze. "You did good today," he said softly. Jamal looked up at him, the knot that had been in his chest for the past week finally loosening. "We did it, Dad." David nodded. "Yeah, we did." With Rocky trotting happily beside them, the three turned and started walking home, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. The neighborhood felt different now, quieter, safer, like they'd taken back something important. Jamal glanced down at Rocky and smiled. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." The house felt quieter than usual that evening, though the tension still lingered in the air. Jamal sat at the dining room table with Rocky curled up at his feet, the German shepherd snoring softly after his long day. The backpack sat in front of Jamal, dirty but intact. His laptop was still safe inside. David poured himself a cup of coffee, then sat across from Jamal, the weight of the day etched into the lines of his face. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The events of the afternoon were still sinking in. Jamal finally broke the silence. "So, what happens now?" David leaned back in his chair, his fingers wrapped around the coffee mug. "Now? The police have him, and he's not getting away this time. But that's not enough, right?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but steady. He looked down at the backpack, his fingers tracing the torn strap. "I mean, what if they just let him go? He said the cops wouldn't care, and for a while he was right." David's expression hardened. "Not this time. We're not letting that happen." Jamal looked up at him, doubt flickering across his face. "How do we make sure? He's just gonna lie and say it's no big deal, and they'll believe him." David set his mug down firmly. "Then we make them listen. We've got everything we need to make a case. The police have the report. They've got him arrested, and we've got evidence of everything he did. How he followed you, threatened you, and stole from you. That's enough to make sure he sees consequences." Jamal frowned slightly, unsure. "But, do you think they'll actually charge him? Like, really do something?" David met his son's gaze, his voice calm but full of resolve. "That's up to us, Jamal. The system works when people push it to work. If we don't step up, then yeah, maybe he gets off easy. But that's not gonna happen here. Not with what he did to you." Jamal nodded slowly, taking in his father's words. "So what do? We follow through," David said firmly. "We talk to the police. We make sure the prosecutor gets everything. Your statement, the evidence, even the fact that he ran and had to be cornered by Rocky. He thought nobody cared, and that's why he did it. But we're gonna show him that we do." Jamal felt his chest tighten with a mix of anger and determination. He shouldn't get away with it, not after all that. "He won't," David said, his voice steady as a rock. "It's not just about the backpack, son. It's about him thinking he could intimidate you, scare you into silence. People like him. They'll keep doing it until someone stops them." Jamal looked down at Rocky, who twitched in his sleep, letting out a soft grunt. "Rocky didn't stop," Jamal murmured, a small smile pulling at his lips. David smiled faintly. "Neither did you. That's the point, Jamal. You fought back. We all did. And now we make sure the law does its part." Jamal straightened up, feeling the weight of what his dad was saying. "So we're gonna help put him in prison." David nodded. "Yeah, we are. We'll talk to the officer tomorrow. Make sure they have everything they need. We'll push until they charge him, and make sure the prosecutor knows we're not backing down." Jamal exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "Do we have to go to court? Maybe," David replied honestly. "But if we do, we'll handle it. You tell your story. I'll be there. And Rocky'll probably get his own fan club for catching the guy." Jamal laughed softly, shaking his head. "He deserves it." David leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You did good today, Jamal. This isn't easy, but you're seeing it through. That matters." Jamal looked up at him, his face serious. "I just don't want him doing this to anyone else." "And he won't," David promised. "We'll make sure of that." Rocky let out another soft snore, stretching out his paws as Jamal reached down to pat his back. "We'll go to the station first thing tomorrow," David added, finishing his coffee. "Get everything in order. The cops can't ignore us now." Jamal nodded, a flicker of pride and determination rising in his chest. "We're gonna stop him." David smiled faintly, his eyes full of quiet pride. "Yeah, we will." For the first time in days, Jamal felt a sense of calm settle over him. The weight of what Mike had done wasn't gone. But now, it wasn't just something hanging over him. It was something they were going to fight back against. Rocky stretched, letting out a happy grunt, and Jamal smiled down at him. "Good boy," he whispered again. The next morning, the air outside was cool and still, the kind of quiet that carried a promise of something shifting. Jamal sat in the passenger seat of David's car, clutching his backpack on his lap. Rocky, who couldn't come this time, sat at the window watching them go, his tail wagging faintly as they pulled out of the driveway. "You ready for this?" David asked, glancing over at Jamal. Jamal nodded, though his hands still gripped the backpack straps tightly. "Yeah, good," David said. "We're not letting up until they take this seriously." The police station felt different this time. When they walked through the glass doors, there wasn't that same weight of doubt hanging over Jamal like before. This time, they had proof, evidence of everything Mike had done. David walked with his usual calm authority, a presence that turned heads as they approached the front desk. "Morning," David said to the officer on duty, his voice firm but polite. "We're here to follow up on the arrest from yesterday. My son was the victim. We've got more to add to the case." The officer, older and more attentive than the one from before, looked up from his computer. "You're the folks with the dog. The arresting officers mentioned you." Jamal straightened a little, pride flickering in his chest at the mention of Rocky. David nodded. "That's us. We're here to make sure this guy doesn't walk away from what he did. We've got details, and we want to make sure the right people hear them." "Of course," the officer replied, gesturing toward a small waiting area. "Have a seat. I'll get the detective handling the case." 15 minutes later, they were sitting in a small interview room with Detective Harris, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened intently as David laid everything out. Every detail of what Mike had done, from stalking Jamal, threatening him, stealing the backpack, and fleeing. "We chased him down because no one else was going to," David said, his voice steady but full of an edge. "My son's dog cornered him, and we recovered the backpack. But it shouldn't have come to that. Now we're here to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Detective Harris looked at Jamal, his gaze softening slightly. "You did good coming forward," he said, "and your dog sounds like a real hero." Jamal smiled faintly, gripping the backpack tighter. Rocky didn't give up. Harris nodded, jotting notes onto a pad. "I see we've got the arrest report here. Suspect's name is Mike Tanner. He's been picked up for theft before. Petty stuff. But this is more than that. Threatening a minor, resisting when the officers showed up. This isn't just petty theft." David leaned forward slightly. "You're saying he's been arrested before?" Harris nodded. "Yeah, but never charged with anything serious. He's one of those guys who skirts the edge of trouble. Until now." He paused, tapping his pen against the notepad. "You're right to push this. We're already holding him, but I'll make sure the prosecutor gets the full picture. The more you give me, the stronger this case gets." David glanced at Jamal, then back to Harris. "What do you need?" Harris flipped open a file folder and slid a statement form across the table. "We need a full statement from Jamal. What happened that day, how he followed you, threatened you, and took the bag. It doesn't have to be long, but it has to be clear. We're building a case that makes it impossible to ignore." Jamal swallowed, suddenly nervous. "I can do that." "Good," Harris said with a small nod. "And if it goes to trial, there's a chance you'll have to testify, Jamal. Are you ready for that?" Jamal looked at his dad, who gave him a reassuring nod. Then he turned back to Harris, his voice steady. "Yeah, I'm ready." Harris smiled faintly. "Good kid." He turned back to David. With Jamal's statement, the arrest, and the recovery of the stolen backpack, we've got a solid case. I'll make sure the prosecutor knows this isn't just another theft. It's bigger than that. David nodded, his jaw tight. It's about accountability. He thought he could intimidate my son, that no one would care. We're here to prove him wrong. Harris stood, shaking David's hand first, and then Jamal's. You're doing the right thing. I'll keep you updated as this moves forward. In the meantime, we'll make sure Mike Tanner doesn't go anywhere. Jamal exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding as they left the room. He felt lighter somehow, like the weight that had been pressing on him was finally beginning to lift. As they walked back to the car, Jamal looked up at his dad. You think it's enough? David opened the door and gestured for Jamal to get in. We gave them everything they need to make this stick. Now, it's their turn to do the right thing. If they don't, we'll push harder, Jamal finished, smiling faintly. David smiled back. That's right. This isn't over yet, but we're not backing down. Rocky's happy bark greeted them as they pulled into the driveway, his tail wagging furiously behind the window. Jamal stepped out of the car and patted the dog's head as he opened the door. We're gonna get him, boy. You'll see. Rocky barked again, as if he understood. Jamal looked over at his dad, the knot of frustration in his chest replaced by something stronger. We're gonna make this right, Dad. David clapped him gently on the back. We already are. The days leading up to Mike's arraignment passed slowly, filled with quiet tension. The weight of the case was pressing on both Jamal and David, but neither of them said it out loud. It was like they were holding their breath, waiting for the next step. Jamal sat at the dining room table one evening, scribbling his statement carefully onto a clean sheet of paper. David sat across from him, reviewing notes they'd taken with Detective Harris. A faint hum of the news played in the background, and Rocky snoozed peacefully under the table. Make sure you write it the way you remember it, Jamal, David said gently, looking up. No need to add anything extra, just be honest and clear. Jamal nodded, pausing to reread what he'd written. Yeah, I'm trying to get it all down. How he followed me, what he said, everything. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he thought out loud. The prosecutor's going to use this to show Mike wasn't just stealing. It was intimidation, threats. He went after you on purpose. Jamal frowned, his pencil tapping against the paper. Do you think it's enough? David met his son's gaze, steady and certain. It's more than enough. Your statement, the backpack, the fact he ran when we caught him, it all paints a picture. Mike thought no one would care. That's his mistake. Jamal sighed, resting his chin in his hand. It still feels weird, though. Like, it's not real. I can't believe I'm writing this about me. David nodded slowly, his voice softer now. It's because you've never had to fight like this before, Jamal. But that's the thing. You're doing it. You're standing up for yourself, for what's right. It's not easy, but it matters. Jamal looked down at Rocky, who stirred slightly at the sound of David's voice, then looked back at his dad. And if we have to go to court, like in front of everybody, you tell your story, David replied firmly. You let them see what he did, and you don't let anyone make you feel small. You've got nothing to hide, son. Jamal swallowed, nodding. Yeah, I can do that. David stood and walked over to Jamal, resting a hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this. I'll be there every step of the way, and you know Rocky's already earned his place in the front row. Jamal laughed softly at that, the tension breaking for a brief moment. The next morning, David and Jamal sat in Detective Harris's office at the station, going over the final preparations. Harris had a thick folder on his desk, the case file that would be handed off to the prosecutor. You've done everything right so far, Harris said, flipping through the notes. Jamal, your statement is clear, and the evidence backs it up. We've got the recovered backpack, Mike Tanner's flight when confronted, and witness testimony from the officers who made the arrest. David leaned forward. You think they'll charge him with more than just theft? Harris nodded. They're looking at larceny, resisting arrest, and intimidation of a minor. It's not just a slap on the wrist. It's enough to push for real time. Jamal shifted in his chair. But we'll have to go to court, right? Harris looked at him with a calm, reassuring expression. Maybe. If he doesn't plead out, and guys like Tanner usually don't, it'll go to trial. But don't let that shake you. The truth is on your side. David patted Jamal's back gently. We've got this. Harris nodded in agreement. Just remember, you're not the one on trial here. Tanner is. Your story, your evidence, and your courage are what's going to make the difference. Jamal sat up straighter, the knot in his stomach loosening slightly. Okay, I can do it. Harris smiled faintly. That's the attitude. You've already done the hard part. You stood up for yourself. Now, we just finish it. David shook the detective's hand as they stood to leave. Thanks for taking this seriously. Harris gave a small nod. It's my job, but you made sure it didn't get ignored. On the drive home, Jamal stared out the window, watching the streets roll by. The neighborhood didn't feel as threatening anymore. It felt like something had shifted, like they were taking back control. Proud of you, son, David said, breaking the silence. Jamal turned to him, surprised. For what? For not backing down? David replied simply. Mike thought he could push you into silence. He was wrong. Jamal nodded, a small smile pulling at his lips. Yeah, he was. They pulled into the driveway, and Rocky greeted them at the door, tail wagging and tongue hanging out. Jamal crouched down, scratching behind his ears. We're almost there, boy. We're gonna finish this. Rocky barked softly, his tail thumping against the floor as if he understood. David stood behind them, his arms crossed, and a satisfied expression on his face. One step at a time, Jamal, but we're getting there. The day of Mike Tanner's arraignment came faster than Jamal expected. The courthouse loomed large and gray under a pale morning sky. Jamal stood beside David at the base of the steps, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. Despite the cool air, sweat pricked the back of his neck. You're good, son, David said quietly, resting a hand on Jamal's shoulder. We're here, together. Jamal nodded, taking a slow breath. He glanced up at the building. Solid. Unshakable. Today was just the start, but it felt like the most important step yet. Inside the courthouse, everything felt colder. Harsh lighting, stone floors, and murmurs echoing off the high ceilings. People bustled past them, each wrapped in their own concerns. But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew why he was there. This way, David said, leading him down a hall to a small courtroom. Detective Harris was already waiting near the back, dressed in a sharp suit, looking more official than ever. He nodded when he saw them. Glad you came. Sit tight. This won't take long. Jamal and David sat in one of the hard wooden benches, the seats creaking beneath them. Jamal looked around nervously. The courtroom was small but intimidating. At the front, the judge sat tall behind the bench, her face serious as she reviewed paperwork. The door to the side opened suddenly, and Jamal felt his breath catch. Mike Tanner shuffled into the room, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was still wearing the same ragged jacket, but his usual smug expression was gone. He looked smaller somehow, disheveled, tired, and, for once, not in control. Jamal's jaw tightened as Mike's eyes flicked toward him briefly before darting away. The sight of him made Jamal's pulse quicken, but Rocky's growl echoed in his memory, steadying him. The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. Case number 34879. State versus Michael Tanner. Charged with larceny, resisting arrest, and intimidation of a minor. Mike didn't react to the charges being read, but Jamal noticed the slight twitch in his jaw. The words hung in the air like a weight. The judge looked down at Mike. Mr. Tanner, you are charged with multiple counts, including theft and intimidation. How do you plead? Mike shifted on his feet, glancing quickly at the lawyer beside him, a disheveled man who looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. The lawyer leaned over, whispering something in Mike's ear before Mike straightened. Not guilty, Mike muttered, his voice low. Jamal blinked, stunned. Not guilty? David didn't move beside him, but Jamal could feel the tension rolling off his father like a storm cloud. The judge's expression didn't change. Very well. Bail is set at $15,000. Cash or bond? Court is adjourned until the trial date is set. The gavel struck the bench, sharp and final. Jamal watched as Mike turned, led away by the bailiff. His shoulders slumped. For a moment, their eyes met again, Mike's gaze hard and angry. But Jamal didn't flinch. He's scared, Jamal realized suddenly. Outside the courtroom, David and Jamal spoke with Detective Harris as they stood near the courthouse steps. He pleaded not guilty, Jamal said, his voice edged with disbelief. How? He knows what he did. Harris sighed, his tone measured. Guys like Tanner always start that way. Pleading guilty means they take the fall, so they hold out as long as they can. Don't let it bother you. It doesn't change the evidence. If anything, it just means he's going to face it all in court. David crossed his arms, his voice firm. So, what happens now? Now, Harris replied, we prepare for trial. The prosecutor will make the case, and you'll likely get a call to testify, Jamal. That's where you tell your story, and the evidence speaks for itself. Jamal nodded, his fists tightening around the straps of his backpack. I'll do it. He can lie all he wants. I'm not letting him get away with it. David smiled faintly, pride flickering in his expression. That's my boy. Harris gave Jamal a small nod. Good attitude. Don't let him shake you. People like Tanner count on victims staying quiet, scared. But you're not scared, are you? Jamal met the detective's gaze, the doubt that had clouded him before finally clearing. No, I'm not. On the ride home, Jamal stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. So, we're really going to court? He asked quietly. David nodded. Yeah, we are. But we've got the truth on our side. The law's catching up to him now, Jamal, and we're not backing down. Jamal let the words settle in his mind. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were closer. Closer to holding Mike Tanner accountable. Closer to showing that his actions had consequences. As they pulled into the driveway, Rocky greeted them again, his tail wagging eagerly. Jamal crouched beside him, scratching his ears. We're not done yet, boy, Jamal whispered with a faint smile. But we're getting there. Rocky barked softly, his tail thumping against the ground as if he understood. Jamal stood, looking toward his dad. We're going to win, right? David smiled, his voice steady and sure. Yeah, son, we are. The morning of the trial carried a heavy stillness, like the calm before a storm. The courthouse bustled with quiet voices and shuffling papers as Jamal and David sat in the front row, waiting. The room was colder than Jamal had expected, the marble floors and tall ceilings doing little to make the space feel welcoming. You good? David asked, leaning close, his voice low. Jamal nodded, though his hands felt clammy where they rested in his lap. Yeah, I'm ready. Good, David replied, his steady presence grounding him. Just tell the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. At the front of the room, Mike Tanner sat slouched at the defense table, wearing a wrinkled jacket and a scowl that hadn't left his face. His lawyer, a tall man with slicked-back hair, whispered something to him. But Mike didn't react. Jamal turned away, forcing himself to focus elsewhere. All rise, the bailiff's voice echoed, signaling the start of the trial. Everyone stood as the judge entered the room. She took her seat behind the bench, her face impassive as she surveyed the room. Jamal sat back down quickly, his pulse quickening as the trial officially began. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. The state of county versus Michael Tanner. Jamal's chest tightened at the sound of Mike's name, but he exhaled slowly, steadying himself. The prosecutor, a tall woman in a dark suit, stood first, her voice clear and firm as she faced the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about accountability. The defendant, Michael Tanner, intimidated a minor, stole from him, and ran, believing no one would care or act. Today, you will hear the truth, supported by evidence, witnesses, and testimony that will make it clear the defendant must be held responsible. Jamal glanced toward Mike. The man shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable, his earlier arrogance replaced by unease. The prosecutor continued. The victim, a child, will bravely share his experience with you. The officers who recovered the stolen property will explain how the defendant tried to evade justice, and we will leave no doubt about what happened and why the law must hold Michael Tanner accountable. The words hung in the air, sharp and certain. Jamal felt the tension in his chest loosen, just slightly, as the prosecutor returned to her seat. Detective Harris took the stand first, walking with his usual calm authority. When he was sworn in, his voice was steady and matter-of-fact as he answered the prosecutor's questions. "Detective Harris, can you describe the events that led to the arrest of Michael Tanner?" Harris nodded. "The report came in from Mr. Turner here." He gestured slightly toward David without breaking stride. The victim reported being approached and intimidated by the defendant, who stole his backpack containing a school-issued laptop. The suspect fled the scene, but thanks to the family's persistence and their dog, we were able to locate and apprehend Mr. Tanner. The stolen property was recovered from his possession. Jamal watched the jury. Some of them glanced briefly at him as Harris spoke, their expressions thoughtful. The defense attorney stood then, moving slowly as he approached Harris. "Detective, you're saying the family's dog cornered the defendant? Is that correct?" "Yes," Harris replied without hesitation. "The dog assisted the family in tracking down the defendant after he fled. Between their observations, the recovered property, and the defendant's attempt to run, the facts are clear." The lawyer's lips twitched faintly. "So we're relying on the testimony of a dog?" Harris's brow lifted slightly. "No, we're relying on the victim's report, the stolen property found in the defendant's possession, and the fact that the defendant ran when confronted. The dog helped, but the evidence stands on its own." The defense lawyer hesitated for a moment, then turned back to his table, clearly unsatisfied. Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach when the prosecutor looked toward him. "We called Jamal Turner to the stand." David gave him a small nod as Jamal stood. His legs felt like rubber as he walked to the front of the courtroom, but his father's words rang in his head, "Just tell the truth." When he sat down, the judge looked at him kindly, though her voice remained firm. "Speak clearly, young man. Take your time." Jamal swallowed hard as he faced the prosecutor. "Can you state your name for the court?" "Jamal Turner," he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. "Jamal, tell us what happened on the day your backpack was stolen." Jamal took a breath, forcing himself to remember every detail. "I was walking home with my dog, Rocky. I noticed this man, Mike Tanner, following me for a while. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then he came up to me. He started asking weird questions, like what was in my bag, and saying it looked expensive. And what happened next? He grabbed the strap. I told him to let go and that I'd call the police, but he said it wouldn't matter, that no one would care. Then he pulled harder, and my dog barked at him, but he still got the bag and ran off." "Thank you, Jamal," the prosecutor said warmly. "What was in the bag?" "My laptop for school." "And did you see this man again later?" Jamal nodded, his hands gripping the sides of the chair. "Yeah, my dad and I were walking Rocky when he found him. Rocky chased him, and we saw him running away with my bag." "Was that when the police arrested him?" "No," Jamal replied. "He got away again, but Rocky cornered him later. That's when my dad called the police, and they arrested him." The prosecutor smiled. "You've done a great job, Jamal. No further questions." The defense attorney approached, trying to smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Jamal, you're sure it was my client who followed you?" "Yes," Jamal replied, his voice clear. "And this dog of yours, how do you know it wasn't mistaken?" Jamal frowned, his confidence growing. Rocky knew it was him. Dogs don't lie. There were faint chuckles from the jury. The lawyer's expression twitched, and he stepped back. No further questions. Jamal walked back to his seat next to his dad, feeling the knot in his chest finally loosen. David gave him a small, proud smile. As the trial continued, Jamal listened to the prosecutor present more evidence: the recovered laptop, the photos of the chase, and testimony from the arresting officers. The facts were lining up like bricks, each one building a wall Mike Tanner couldn't climb over. Jamal glanced toward Mike at the defense table. He wasn't glaring anymore. He just looked tired, like he knew the walls were closing in. David leaned over and whispered, "You did good, Jamal." Jamal smiled faintly, sitting back as the case continued. The final day of the trial carried a different energy. The courtroom felt charged, as if everyone in it knew the end was near. Jamal sat beside David, clutching his backpack tightly in his lap. This time, he wasn't nervous. He was ready. Mike Tanner sat slumped at the defense table, his once defiant demeanor replaced by visible defeat. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Mike just stared down at the table, not bothering to respond. The prosecutor stood and faced the jury one final time. Her voice was clear, steady, and sharp as a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've seen the truth laid out before you. The defendant followed and intimidated a child, stole his property, and then ran when confronted. The evidence speaks for itself. Jamal Turner's testimony, the recovery of the stolen laptop, the defendant's attempt to flee. There is no question about what happened here. This case is about accountability. Mr. Tanner thought he could take advantage of someone smaller and more vulnerable, that no one would stand up to him. But Jamal did. His family did. And now it's time for the law to do the same. I ask that you find the defendant guilty on all charges." Jamal sat up straighter as the prosecutor returned to her seat, her expression confident. The defense lawyer stood next, his tone far less certain. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client made mistakes, but he's not some hardened criminal. This is just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He doesn't deserve to have his life ruined over a backpack. Consider the circumstances. Show him some leniency." David shook his head slightly, his expression hard as stone. Jamal gripped his backpack tighter, anger rising in his chest. Leniency? After everything he did? The defense lawyer sat down, and the judge addressed the jury. "You have heard the evidence presented in this case. It is now your duty to determine whether the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You are dismissed to deliberate." The jury stood and filed out of the room, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Jamal looked up at David. "How long do you think it'll take?" "Not long," David replied, his voice calm. They saw everything they needed to. The wait felt endless, but it was less than an hour before the jury returned. "All rise," the bailiff called out as the judge entered. The jury filed back into their seats, their expressions serious. Jamal held his breath, his heart pounding as the foreman stood with a small piece of paper in his hand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreman unfolded the paper, cleared his throat, and read aloud. "In the case of the State of County versus Michael Tanner, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of larceny, resisting arrest, and intimidation of a minor." The words hit Jamal like a wave of relief. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. David placed a firm hand on his shoulder, pride and satisfaction radiating from him. Mike Tanner's face fell. His shoulders sagged as he stared at the table. All the fight drained from him. The judge's voice was final and unwavering. "Michael Tanner, you have been found guilty on all charges. Given the nature of these crimes, including the intimidation of a minor, I am sentencing you to 3 years in state prison, effective immediately." There was a faint gasp from someone in the back of the courtroom. Jamal watched as 2 officers approached Mike, cuffing his hands behind his back. For the first time, Mike looked up, his eyes meeting Jamal. There was no anger left in them, just defeat. "You'll regret this," Mike muttered bitterly as the officers pulled him to his feet. David's voice was low but firm. "No, you'll regret what you did." Mike didn't respond. He was led from the courtroom, his footsteps heavy and shuffling, the sound fading until the door closed behind him. Jamal felt the weight that had been sitting on his chest for weeks finally lift. He turned to David, a small smile breaking through. "We did it, Dad." David nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, we did. You did, Jamal. You stood your ground." Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly, a stark contrast to the cold, gray tension of the trial. Jamal stood at the top of the steps, breathing in the fresh air as David stood beside him. "You feel better now?" David asked. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, It's like, it's finally over. David smiled faintly. That's justice, son. You fought for it, and you won. Rocky's bark cut through the moment as they reached the car, his tail thumping wildly as he greeted them through the window. Jamal laughed, crouching to open the door and pat Rocky's head. You missed it, boy, Jamal said with a grin, but we got him. He's gone. Rocky barked again, as if in agreement. David rested a hand on Jamal's shoulder as they stood together, the courthouse fading behind them. Mike Tanner thought he could take something from you and get away with it. You proved him wrong. Remember that. Jamal nodded, feeling stronger than he ever had before. I won't forget. David opened the car door, gesturing for Jamal to climb in. Come on, let's go home. Rocky earned a steak dinner. Jamal laughed, climbing in beside his dog. As they drove away, he looked out at the streets that had once felt threatening, but now felt like his again. Justice had been served, and for the first time in weeks, everything felt right. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the kitchen window as Jamal stood by the counter, carefully unwrapping a thick, juicy steak. Rocky sat a few feet away on the tiled floor, ears perked, tail thumping eagerly against the cabinets. His eyes never left Jamal's hands, anticipation making his whole body twitch with excitement. You're not fooling anyone, boy, Jamal teased with a grin, holding up the steak for a second. You know this is yours. Rocky let out a soft bark, as if to say, hurry up already. David leaned against the doorway, watching the scene with a faint smile. He's earned it, he said. Never seen a dog work so hard for justice before. Jamal laughed as he placed the steak on a plate and set it down on the floor. Rocky lunged forward with an excited bark, devouring his reward with loud, satisfied chomps. There you go, Rocky, Jamal said, crouching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. You're the best. Rocky wagged his tail furiously in response, too busy enjoying his prize to lift his head. David stepped into the kitchen, clapping Jamal gently on the back. You know, you deserve a reward, too, he said. You fought for what was right. That takes guts. Jamal looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I couldn't have done it without you. And Rocky, David added with a chuckle. Jamal grinned. And Rocky. They stood quietly for a moment, the kitchen filled with the sound of Rocky enjoying his steak and the faint hum of the refrigerator. You feel better now? David asked softly. Jamal nodded, his shoulders finally feeling light. Yeah, it's over. I didn't think it'd feel like this, but it does. Like I got something back. David met his gaze, his voice steady and full of pride. You did get something back. Your voice, your confidence. And the next time someone tries to take that from you, you'll know you can fight for it. Jamal let those words sink in, feeling them settle deep. Thanks, Dad, he said quietly. David smiled. I'm proud of you, Jamal. You stood up for yourself. That matters more than anything. Jamal looked down at Rocky, whose tail wagged lazily as he finished the last bite of his steak. The dog sat back, licking his chops with a satisfied grunt before flopping onto the floor, stretched out and happy. Good boy, Jamal said again, ruffling Rocky's fur. You deserve that. Later that evening, Jamal sat on the back porch with Rocky sprawled beside him. The quiet hum of the neighborhood felt different now. Peaceful, not threatening. The streets no longer felt like they belonged to someone else. They belonged to him again. Rocky let out a deep, contented sigh, and Jamal grinned, scratching the dog's head. You're a hero. You know that? Rocky thumped his tail in response, his eyes half closed in sleep. David stepped out onto the porch, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. He handed one to Jamal and sat beside him, looking out at the darkening sky. You thinking about everything that happened? David asked, sipping his drink. A little, Jamal admitted. It's weird how one thing like that can change everything. David nodded, his gaze steady. Yeah, life's like that sometimes, but it's not the bad thing that defines you. It's how you respond to it. You proved something to yourself, Jamal, and that's a lesson you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. Jamal sipped his lemonade, looking down at Rocky, who let out another snore. And I know Rocky's got my back, no matter what, David chuckled. That dog's got the heart of a lion. I'm pretty sure he'd take on the whole world for you." Jamal smiled, letting the calm of the evening wash over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt completely at peace. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. David patted his shoulder. "Anytime, son." The stars began to appear, one by one, dotting the darkening sky with faint light. Rocky snored softly beside them, and the hum of the neighborhood faded into the background. Jamal sat back, feeling stronger, safer, and more sure of himself than ever before. He glanced at Rocky and whispered, "We did it, boy." Rocky's tail thumped gently against the wood in response, and Jamal smiled. It was over. They had won.